Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never see coming. Sarah Chen had been making lattes for 3 years at Corner Café, and in all that time not a single customer had looked at her twice. She was the invisible woman behind the espresso machine, the quiet barista who remembered your order but never your name. But when 5 armed men walked through that door on a Tuesday morning, everything changed. In less than 10 seconds, the overlooked coffee maker became the only thing standing between innocent people and certain death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The steam wand hissed softly as Sarah Chen adjusted the milk temperature for what felt like the 1000th time that morning. At 28, she had perfected the art of being unremarkable. Average height, shoulder-length dark hair usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the same forest green apron that every employee at Corner Café wore. She moved with quiet efficiency behind the counter, her hands working automatically to craft drinks while her mind remained alert to everything happening around her. Corner Café sat on the busy intersection of Fifth and Madison in downtown Portland, a small haven of warmth and caffeine in the heart of the business district. The morning rush had settled into the comfortable mid-morning lull, leaving Sarah with a handful of regular customers scattered throughout the cozy space. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, mixing with the gentle murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of ceramic against wood. Sarah had been working at Corner Café for 3 years, 2 months and 16 days. Not that anyone was counting, least of all her customers. She was the kind of employee who showed up early, stayed late when needed, and never caused problems. Her manager, David Rodriguez, often forgot she was there until closing time, when he'd find the entire cafe cleaned and organized without being asked. She was reliable, invisible, and exactly the kind of person who could disappear into the background of daily life. The cafe itself reflected the neighborhood's character perfectly. Exposed brick walls lined with local artwork, mismatched vintage furniture that somehow worked together, and large windows that let in streams of natural light. The space felt lived in and comfortable, the kind of place where freelancers could work for hours on a single cup of coffee without being hassled, where business meetings happened over croissants, and where the same faces appeared every morning like clockwork. Sarah knew all the regulars by sight, if not by name. There was Margaret Walsh, the retired librarian who ordered a small dark roast with 1 sugar every morning at exactly 8:15. She always sat at the corner table by the window, reading thick paperback novels and occasionally making disapproving sounds at whatever was happening in the story. Then there was Kevin Park, the young architect who came in twice a day for elaborate espresso drinks that changed based on his mood. Happy Kevin ordered caramel macchiatos. Stressed Kevin stuck to straight espresso shots. The businessman in the expensive suit who never looked up from his phone was Tom Harrison, though Sarah only knew his name because she'd overheard him taking conference calls. He ordered the same thing every day: large Americano, no room, extra shot. He paid with the same credit card, left the same minimal tip, and never once made eye contact. To him, Sarah was simply part of the machinery that produced his caffeine fix. This Tuesday morning was following the usual pattern. Margaret had finished her novel and was starting a new one. Kevin was in stressed mode, having downed 2 espresso shots while frantically sketching building plans on his tablet. Tom was pacing near the front windows, conducting what sounded like an important merger discussion with someone who clearly wasn't listening to his suggestions. Sarah moved through her routine with practiced ease. She restocked the pastry case, wiped down the espresso machine, and began preparing for the lunch crowd that would arrive in a few hours. Her movements were economical and precise, each action serving a purpose. She never wasted motion, never made unnecessary noise, and never drew attention to herself. The bell above the front door chimed softly as Dr. Emily Foster entered, right on schedule. The pediatrician worked at the Children's Hospital 6 blocks away and had been coming to Corner Café for her afternoon break for the past year. She always ordered the same thing: medium vanilla latte with oat milk and an extra shot. She always sat at the table near the back corner where she could review patient files in relative privacy. "The usual, Dr. Foster?" Sarah asked quietly, already reaching for the oat milk. "Please. And Sarah, you can call me Emily. We've been doing this dance for a year now." Sarah smiled politely but didn't respond. She'd learned that maintaining friendly but professional distance was the safest approach. Get too personal and customers started asking questions about your life, your background, your plans. Sarah had learned to deflect such conversations before they began. As she crafted Emily's latte, Sarah's eyes automatically scanned the cafe. It was a habit so ingrained she barely noticed doing it anymore. 6 customers currently in the space. Margaret at her usual table, now 30 pages into her new mystery novel. Kevin had calmed down slightly and was working on what looked like a presentation. Tom was still pacing and talking, his voice carrying more frustration than before. Emily was settling into her corner table with a stack of medical charts. 2 new customers had arrived while Sarah was making the latte. A college student with a laptop bag and tired eyes, probably needing caffeine to power through studying. She ordered a large coffee with extra cream and found a table near the middle of the cafe. The other newcomer was Jake Morrison, a local food blogger who came in occasionally to work on his restaurant reviews. He ordered a cappuccino and claimed his favorite spot near the window where he could people watch while writing. The cafe felt peaceful, almost drowsy in the warm afternoon light filtering through the windows. The kind of atmosphere that made people linger over their drinks, that turned a quick coffee run into an hour of unexpected relaxation. Sarah had always appreciated this quality about Corner Café. It wasn't rushed or frantic like some of the chain coffee shops downtown. It had character and personality. Sarah finished Emily's latte and called out her name softly. As the doctor approached the counter, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. Emily's hands were shaking slightly as she reached for her drink, and there were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there the week before. "Everything all right?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily looked surprised by the question. In all their interactions, Sarah had never asked anything personal. "Long night at the hospital. We had several emergency cases come in and I've been up for about 36 hours straight. Maybe decaf would be better," Sarah suggested gently. "Probably, but I've got 4 more hours left on my shift. I need all the help I can get." Emily managed a tired smile. "Thanks for asking, though I don't think anyone's checked on me in weeks." As Emily returned to her table, Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The urge to help, to do more than just serve coffee and mind her own business. It was an instinct she'd learned to suppress over the years, but it never completely went away. Some people were natural helpers, drawn to fix problems and ease suffering wherever they found it. Sarah had learned that sometimes helping people meant staying invisible, avoiding situations where her particular skills might be needed. The afternoon crowd began to build slowly. A group of high school students claimed the large table near the back, spreading out textbooks and laptops for what looked like a serious study session. A young mother with a stroller ordered an iced coffee and found a spot where she could keep her sleeping baby out of the main traffic flow. An elderly man with a cane made his way to the counter, moving slowly but determinedly. "What can I get for you?" Sarah asked. "Hot tea, please. Something soothing. My doctor says I need to cut back on caffeine, but I still like the ritual of a warm drink." Sarah selected chamomile tea and prepared it carefully, making sure the water temperature was exactly right. She'd noticed that older customers often appreciated extra attention to detail, small gestures that showed respect for their preferences and needs. "Beautiful afternoon," the man commented as Sarah handed him his tea. "It is perfect weather for sitting by the window. You know, I've been coming here for 6 months and you always remember exactly how I like my tea prepared. That's rare these days." Sarah smiled but didn't elaborate. She'd learned that acknowledging compliments without encouraging longer conversations was an art form. Too much friendliness invited personal questions. Too little seemed rude. The balance had taken her years to perfect. As the man settled at a window table with his tea, Sarah returned to her routine tasks. She restocked napkins, cleaned the steam wands, and began preparing for the evening shift change. David would arrive in an hour to handle the dinner crowd, and Sarah would fade back into her life outside the cafe. Her apartment was a 15-minute walk from Corner Café, a small one-bedroom space above a used bookstore. The owner, Miss Chen, no relation despite sharing a surname, had rented it to Sarah 3 years ago and rarely bothered her except to collect rent. It was perfect for someone who valued privacy and quiet. Sarah's apartment was sparsely furnished but carefully organized. A small couch, a television that rarely got used, bookshelves lined with volumes on everything from philosophy to mechanical engineering. The kitchen was compact but functional, equipped with high-quality knives and cookware that seemed expensive for someone who made barista wages. The bedroom contained only the essentials: a bed, a dresser, and a closet that was surprisingly organized considering how little Sarah seemed to own. The most unusual feature of Sarah's apartment was what wasn't visible. Hidden throughout the space were small modifications that would be meaningless to most visitors but significant to someone with the right knowledge. Door frames reinforced in ways that weren't obvious. Windows that could be secured quickly from the inside. a fire escape route that had been carefully planned and practiced. But those details belonged to a different life, one that Sarah had left behind when she'd decided to become invisible 3 years. Corner Café represented safety through anonymity. As long as no one looked too closely, as long as she remained just another face in the crowd, she could maintain the peaceful existence she'd built. The bell above the door chimed again, drawing Sarah's attention back to the present. A woman in a business suit entered, checking her phone and looking around the cafe with the quick assessment of someone evaluating a space for a meeting. She approached the counter with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. Large Americano, 2 shots, and do you have somewhere quiet where I can take a phone call? It's important. Sarah gestured toward the back corner near Emily's table. That area is usually quieter. The acoustics are better for phone calls. Perfect, thank you. As Sarah prepared she noticed the woman's phone was already ringing. The conversation that followed was clearly business-related, something about quarterly projections and market analysis. The woman's voice carried easily across the cafe, but most customers were absorbed in their own activities and didn't seem to notice. The rhythm of the afternoon continued peacefully. Students studying, workers taking breaks, regulars settling into their familiar routines. Sarah moved through her tasks with quiet efficiency, invisible and content to remain that way. She refilled Margaret's coffee without being asked, cleaned tables as soon as they were vacated, and maintained the kind of seamless service that kept customers comfortable without drawing attention to the person providing it. At 4:30, David arrived for the evening shift. He was a good manager, fair and reliable, but he had the busy parent's tendency to be distracted by multiple responsibilities. His 2 young children meant he was always juggling cafe duties with school pickup times and soccer practices. How was the afternoon, he asked, tying on his apron. Steady. Nothing unusual. Dr. Foster mentioned she's been working long hours, and Mr. Peterson seemed tired when he came in for his tea. David nodded, appreciating Sarah's attention to customer details. She had an uncanny ability to remember personal information about regulars, to notice when someone seemed off or needed extra care. It was one of the reasons he valued her as an employee, though he'd never quite figured out how she managed to be so observant while remaining practically invisible herself. I can stay a bit longer if you need help with the dinner prep, Sarah offered. No. Go ahead and take off. Jennifer's coming in at 5 for the evening shift. Enjoy your night off. Sarah untied her apron and gathered her things from the small employee area behind the counter. Her backpack was simple and practical, the kind carried by thousands of commuters every day. Inside, along with the usual items like keys and wallet, were a few things that might have seemed unusual for a barista. A first aid kit more comprehensive than most people carried. A small tool kit with items that could be useful in various situations. A phone with contacts that weren't associated with coffee shop work, but those details were remnants from before, items she'd never quite been able to eliminate entirely. They remained hidden and unused, reminders of skills and connections that belonged to a different version of herself. As Sarah prepared to leave, she took one final look around Corner Café.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Margaret was packing up her things, her novel finished for the day. Kevin had successfully completed whatever project had been stressing him and was smiling at his tablet screen. Tom had ended his phone call and was actually sitting down for the first time, looking slightly more relaxed. Emily had dozed off at her corner table, her medical charts scattered around her empty latte cup. The scene was peaceful and familiar, exactly the kind of environment Sarah had sought when she decided to build a quiet life. Tomorrow would bring the same routines, the same customers, the same comfortable anonymity. She would make coffee, clean tables, and remain invisible in plain sight. Walking toward the front door, Sarah moved with the same economical grace that characterized all her actions. Not hurried, not slow, just purposeful and efficient. The kind of movement that drew no attention because it seemed completely natural and unremarkable. The bell chimed softly as she opened the door, stepping out into the late afternoon warmth. Portland's downtown streets were busy with end-of-workday traffic, both vehicular and pedestrian. People hurrying toward bus stops, others window shopping their way home, the usual mix of urban life continuing its daily patterns. Sarah walked the familiar route toward her apartment, past the bookstore that served as her landlord, past the small park where she sometimes sat on benches to read, past the corner market where she bought groceries with cash and minimal conversation. Her neighborhood was perfect for someone who wanted to live quietly. Busy enough that one more person didn't stand out, but stable enough that she could develop routines without attracting attention. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Sarah reflected on how successfully she'd managed to build this life. 3 years of peaceful anonymity, of work that was satisfying without being challenging, of relationships that were friendly without being personal. She'd found exactly what she'd been looking for when she decided to disappear from her previous existence. Her apartment welcomed her with familiar silence and order. Sarah set her backpack on the small table near the door and moved to the kitchen to prepare dinner, something simple and nutritious, eaten while reading one of the books from her well-stocked shelves. The evening would be quiet and solitary, exactly as she preferred, but as Sarah reached for ingredients, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For just a moment, her body tensed in a way that had nothing to do with making coffee or living invisibly. Her hand moved toward the phone with careful precision, and her eyes scanned the message with an intensity that belonged to someone trained to evaluate threats and respond accordingly. The message was simple: package delivered to Corner Café, pick up tomorrow morning. Sarah stared at the text for a long moment, her peaceful evening suddenly feeling less certain. After 3 years of successful invisibility, someone had found a way to reach her. Someone knew where she worked and how to contact her. The life she'd built so carefully was about to become complicated in ways she'd hoped to avoid forever. She deleted the message and set the phone aside, but the damage was done. The invisible barista who'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of being overlooked was about to discover that some things couldn't remain hidden indefinitely. Tomorrow's shift at Corner Café would be different from all the others, though she had no way of knowing just how different it would become. Sarah arrived at Corner Café 30 minutes earlier than usual, the mysterious text message from the night before weighing heavily on her mind. The morning air was crisp, and the streets were still quiet except for the occasional early commuter heading to work. She used her key to enter through the back door, moving through the familiar space with heightened awareness. Everything appeared normal. The chairs were still stacked on tables from the previous night's cleaning, the espresso machine sat silent and cold, and the pastry case was empty, waiting for the morning delivery from the local bakery. Sarah began her opening routine, but her movements were more deliberate than usual, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. The package was sitting on the counter near the register, innocuous and unremarkable. A small brown envelope with no return address, Sarah's name written in block letters across the front, no postal markings, which meant it had been hand-delivered. Sarah stared at it for several minutes before approaching, her instincts warning her that opening it would change everything. Inside the envelope was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed a man she recognized immediately, though she hadn't seen his face in 3 years. Marcus Webb, her former handler, standing outside a federal building in Washington, D.C. The timestamp indicated the photo had been taken just 2 days ago. The note was brief and unsigned: "He's been asking questions. Time to move again. Usual protocols, 48 hours. Sarah's hands remained steady as she processed the information, but inside, her carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. Someone had found her despite 3 years of perfect invisibility. Someone knew about Marcus, knew about her past, and was warning her that her peaceful life was about to end. She destroyed the photograph and note immediately, burning them in the small metal trash can behind the counter, until nothing remained but ash. Then she began preparing for what might be her last normal day at Corner Café, though she knew that normal was no longer an option. David arrived at his usual time, bringing the morning pastries and his characteristic blend of efficiency and distraction. "You're here early," he observed, noting that Sarah had already completed most of the opening tasks. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I might as well be productive." "I appreciate it. Jennifer called in sick, so we'll be short-staffed this morning. Think you can handle the rush?" "Of course." As David busied himself with the morning prep work, Sarah's mind was already calculating contingencies. If Marcus was asking questions, it meant someone had connected her current identity to her previous work. The warning gave her 48 hours to disappear again, to abandon the life she'd built and start over somewhere else. But first, she needed to understand how she'd been found. The morning rush began earlier than usual, a steady stream of customers seeking caffeine before facing their daily responsibilities. Sarah fell into her familiar rhythm, but part of her attention remained focused on every person who entered the cafe. Were any of them watching her too closely? Did anyone seem out of place? Margaret Walsh arrived precisely at 8:15, ordering her small dark roast with 1 sugar, and settling at her usual table with a new mystery novel. Her routine was so established that Sarah could have set her watch by it. Kevin Park followed 20 minutes later, clearly having one of his stressed mornings based on his order of 3 espresso shots and his frantic typing on his laptop. The businessman Tom Harrison was running late, arriving nearly an hour past his usual time, and looking more frazzled than Sarah had ever seen him. He paced near the counter while waiting for his Americano, conducting an animated phone conversation about some kind of crisis at his office. "No, I told you yesterday that the Peterson account needs those numbers by noon," he was saying, his voice carrying more tension than usual. "If we don't have them, the entire deal falls apart." Sarah noted the change in his routine but didn't think much of it. People had bad days, dealt with work stress, faced deadlines that disrupted their normal patterns. She handed him his drink and watched him hurry out, still talking rapidly into his phone. Dr. Emily Foster entered at her usual time, looking slightly more rested than she had the previous day. She approached the counter with a genuine smile, something that hadn't happened often during their year of brief interactions. "Medium vanilla latte, with oat milk and an extra shot," Sarah said before Emily could order. "You know, I was thinking about our conversation yesterday. I can't remember the last time someone at a coffee shop actually asked how I was doing. It meant more than you probably realize." Sarah felt that familiar tension in her chest, the conflict between wanting to help and needing to maintain distance. Bad days happen to everyone. Sometimes a kind word helps. It does. And I wanted you to know that I had the best sleep I've had in weeks after I got home yesterday. Sometimes we forget to take care of ourselves when we're busy taking care of everyone else. As Emily settled at her corner table with her medical charts, Sarah reflected on how many small interactions like this she'd shared over the past 3 years. Brief moments of human connection that never developed into anything deeper, but that had provided both comfort and meaning within the boundaries of her carefully constructed life. The college student with the laptop bag returned, looking even more exhausted than she had the day before. She ordered a large coffee with extra cream and found the same table near the middle of the cafe. Sarah watched her pull out thick textbooks and notes, settling in for what looked like a long study session. Around 10 o'clock, 2 new customers entered who immediately caught Sarah's attention. Both men, both wearing business suits that seemed slightly too formal for Corner Café's casual atmosphere. They ordered simple drinks, black coffee and tea, and found a table near the front window, where they could observe both the interior of the cafe and the street outside. Their presence felt wrong in a way that Sarah couldn't immediately articulate. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing that would have concerned most people. But Sarah had been trained to notice subtleties, to recognize when people didn't quite fit their stated purpose. These men weren't here for coffee or conversation, they were here to watch. Sarah continued her work, maintaining her usual routine while keeping the 2 men in her peripheral vision. They weren't looking at her directly, but she could sense their awareness of her movements. Professional surveillance, subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. The morning progressed with increasing tension that only Sarah seemed to notice. The 2 men nursed their drinks far longer than normal customers would, occasionally checking their phones but always maintaining visual contact with the cafe's interior. Other customers came and went according to their usual patterns, unaware that the peaceful atmosphere they valued was being carefully monitored. Jake Morrison, the food blogger, arrived with his laptop and claimed his favorite table near the window. He ordered a cappuccino and seemed to settle in for a productive writing session, but Sarah noticed he was positioning himself where he could observe the 2 men without appearing to do so. Either he was unusually observant for a civilian, or he wasn't who he appeared to be. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to form, and Sarah didn't like the picture they were creating. Too many people watching, too many changes in routine, too many coincidences for comfort. The warning about Marcus asking questions was starting to feel less like paranoia and more like accurate intelligence. At 11:30, another customer entered who made Sarah's blood run cold. A woman in her 40s, professionally dressed, with the kind of bearing that suggested military or law enforcement background. She ordered a simple coffee and selected a table that provided clear sight lines to both the counter and the back exit. Sarah recognized the tactical positioning immediately. More concerning was the fact that Sarah recognized the woman herself. Agent Lisa Rodriguez, FBI, someone she'd worked with years ago on operations that had never been officially acknowledged. Lisa's presence meant this wasn't just about Marcus asking questions, this was about Sarah's former life catching up with her in ways that would be difficult to escape. Lisa made no sign of recognition, ordering her coffee with the same polite professionalism she would show any barista. But her presence confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Whatever had triggered the warning message was serious enough to bring federal agents into the situation. Sarah began mentally reviewing her exit strategies while maintaining her external composure. The back door led to an alley that connected to 3 different streets. Her apartment was a 15-minute walk, but going there would be a mistake if they knew her identity. Her emergency supplies were hidden in a storage locker across town, accessible but requiring transportation she didn't currently have. The lunch crowd began arriving earlier than usual, adding to the complexity of the situation. More people meant more potential witnesses, but also more confusion if things went wrong. Sarah found herself calculating crowd dynamics while continuing to make sandwiches and coffee drinks. David was working the register while Sarah handled drink preparation, their usual division of labor during busy periods. But Sarah noticed he was being more observant than usual, occasionally glancing at the customers in ways that seemed more purposeful than casual management oversight. "Busy morning," he commented during a brief lull. "More than usual for a Tuesday." "Yeah, I noticed. Lots of new faces today." Sarah met his eyes and saw something there that hadn't been present in their previous interactions. A knowledge that went beyond managing a coffee shop, an awareness that suggested David understood more about the current situation than his casual demeanor indicated. "Everything okay?" she asked carefully. "Should be. Just keeping an eye on things." The conversation felt loaded with meaning that neither of them could express directly. Sarah began to wonder how many of the people in her carefully constructed quiet life were exactly who they appeared to be. At 12:15, the situation escalated dramatically. A black SUV pulled up outside Corner Café, and 3 men in dark suits got out. They weren't making any effort to be subtle, and their arrival sent a visible ripple of tension through the customers who'd been watching from inside. The 2 men, who'd been nursing coffee near the front window, immediately stood and moved toward the back of the cafe. Agent Rodriguez finished her drink and walked to the counter, ostensibly to order a refill but actually to position herself between Sarah and the front entrance. Jake Morrison closed his laptop and shifted in his seat, and Sarah noticed the bulge under his jacket that suggested he was armed. The college student looked up from her textbooks with an expression of fear that seemed genuine and unrelated to whatever was happening around her. Dr. Emily Foster gathered her medical charts and moved toward the front of the cafe, apparently oblivious to the tension building around her. Margaret Walsh remained absorbed in her mystery novel, either unaware of the real drama unfolding or remarkably good at maintaining cover. Sarah realized she was surrounded by people who were far more than they appeared to be, and that her peaceful life as an invisible barista was about to end in ways she hadn't anticipated. The 3 men from the SUV were approaching the front door, and she had perhaps 30 seconds to decide how to respond to whatever was about to happen. David appeared beside her, no longer playing the role of distracted cafe manager. "Back door?" he asked quietly. "Blocked," Sarah replied, having noticed that the alley was now occupied by additional personnel. "How do you want to handle this?" The question confirmed that David knew exactly who she was and what kind of situation was developing. Sarah's mind raced through options while her hands continued working automatically, completing a drink order as if nothing unusual was happening.
The front door opened and the 3 men entered with the confident stride of people accustomed to getting immediate cooperation. They weren't displaying weapons, but their body language made it clear that resistance would not be tolerated. The lead man was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a voice that carried easily across the cafe, "federal agents. We need everyone to remain calm and stay where you are while we conduct official business." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The college student looked genuinely terrified, clutching her textbooks as if they could provide protection. Margaret Walsh finally looked up from her novel, her expression more annoyed than afraid. Dr. Foster moved protectively toward the girl with the textbooks, her medical training taking over despite the unusual circumstances. But the other customers reacted with the kind of professional calm that suggested they'd expected this moment.
Agent Rodriguez maintained her position near the counter. The two men who'd been watching all morning were now clearly revealed as additional federal personnel. Even Jake Morrison seemed unsurprised by the development. Sarah found herself in the center of a situation that had obviously been planned and coordinated by multiple agencies. Her 3 years of successful invisibility had ended not because she'd made a mistake, but because forces beyond her control had decided it was time for her to be found. The lead agent approached the counter, his eyes fixed on Sarah with the intensity of someone who'd been searching for a long time. Sarah Chen, also known as Agent Rachel Morrison, also known as a dozen other identities we've tracked over the past 18 months. You're a difficult person to locate. Sarah met his gaze steadily, her external composure perfect despite the internal calculations racing through her mind. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by professionals who'd obviously planned this operation carefully. But surrender had never been her first instinct, and 3 years of peace hadn't changed that fundamental aspect of her personality. I think you have me confused with someone else, she said calmly, continuing to wipe down the counter as if federal agents entered Corner Café every day. I'm just a barista. The agent smiled without humor. A barista who's been living under a perfect false identity, working at a cafe owned by someone with connections to agencies that don't officially exist, in a neighborhood that's been under surveillance for the past 6 months. This isn't coincidence, Rachel. This is endgame. The revelation that David and possibly Corner Café itself were connected to her former life sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the espresso machine behind her. Her carefully chosen quiet life had been an illusion, constructed by people who'd been watching and waiting for the right moment to bring her back into the world she'd tried to leave behind. She looked around the cafe with new understanding. Dr. Foster was positioning herself to provide medical support if needed. The college student was probably the only genuine civilian in the space, which explained why everyone else was subtly moving to protect her. Margaret Walsh had set down her novel and was watching the proceedings with the alert attention of someone trained in tactical assessment. What do you want? Sarah asked, abandoning the pretense that she didn't understand what was happening. We want you to come in voluntarily. There's a situation developing that requires your particular expertise. People are going to die if we can't resolve it, and you're the only operative with the skills and knowledge necessary to prevent a catastrophe. Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders. For 3 years she'd successfully avoided the kind of moral complexity that had defined her previous work, but the suggestion that innocent people would suffer because of her absence triggered instincts that were stronger than her desire for peaceful anonymity. And if I refuse, then we'll have a very public arrest, a lot of uncomfortable questions for everyone in this cafe, and a situation that deteriorates rapidly while we waste time on legal proceedings. But people still die, and you still end up back where you started, just with more collateral damage. The agent's words hung in the air like a challenge and a threat combined. Sarah could see the truth in his eyes. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a carefully orchestrated intervention designed to give her the illusion of choice while making it clear that only one option was actually available. David moved closer, his expression sympathetic but resigned. I'm sorry, Sarah. I hoped it would never come to this. But they're right about the situation being critical, and they're right about you being the only one who can handle it. The betrayal stung more than Sarah had expected. 3 years of working together, of daily interactions and shared responsibilities, and David had been reporting to someone else the entire time. Her peaceful life hadn't been real, it had been an extended undercover assignment that she hadn't known she was participating in. But as she looked around the cafe at the faces of people she'd thought were customers and colleagues, Sarah realized that her anger was less important than the implications of what the agent had said. Somewhere, people were in danger. Somewhere, a situation was developing that required intervention by someone with her specific skills and experience. The invisible barista who'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of being overlooked was about to discover that some responsibilities couldn't be abandoned, no matter how successfully you managed to disappear. Her quiet life was ending, but the question remained whether she would go willingly or force a confrontation that could put innocent people at risk. The lead agent extended his hand in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and commanding. Agent Morrison, we need you back in the field. The country needs you back in the field. Will you come with us voluntarily? Sarah looked one final time around Corner Café, at the life she'd built that had turned out to be an illusion, at the people she'd thought were customers who'd actually been guardians, at the peaceful existence that had never been as real as she'd believed. Then she untied her apron and stepped out from behind the counter, ready to become someone other than the invisible barista she'd been for 3 years. The black SUV's interior was nothing like the vehicles Sarah had been transported in during her operational years. No reinforced panels, no communication equipment, just leather seats and tinted windows that suggested corporate rather than government transport. Agent Thompson, the lead operative who'd approached her at the cafe, sat across from her while Agent Rodriguez drove through downtown Portland's increasingly congested streets. "The situation briefing will begin once we reach the facility," Thompson explained, his tone professional but not unfriendly. "I know this feels like an abduction, but I want you to understand that we explored every other option before deciding to approach you directly." Sarah remained silent, studying the passing cityscape through the tinted glass. Portland looked the same as it had that morning when she'd walked to work, but everything felt different now that her carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered. The people on the sidewalks were just people again, not potential threats or assets to be catalogued and assessed. "How long have you been watching me?" she finally asked. "Continuously for 6 months, intermittently for the past 2 years." The revelation that her peaceful life had been under surveillance for most of its duration felt like a physical blow. Every quiet evening in her apartment, every routine morning at Corner Café, every moment of contentment she'd experienced had been observed and recorded by people she'd never seen. David knew from the beginning. David Rodriguez is a retired FBI agent who was recruited specifically to provide oversight for your situation. Corner Café was selected as your workplace because it offered optimal sightlines, controllable access points, and a customer base that could be monitored effectively. Sarah closed her eyes, processing the full scope of the deception. Her entire quiet life had been an elaborate stage production, with her as the unwitting star performer. The customers she'd grown fond of, the routines that had provided comfort, the sense of belonging she'd developed, all of it had been carefully orchestrated by people who'd been planning for this moment since the day she'd first tied on her apron. Dr. Foster, Margaret Walsh, were any of them real? Dr. Foster is exactly who she appears to be. A pediatrician who genuinely needs caffeine to get through her shifts, and who actually appreciated your concern for her well-being. Margaret Walsh is retired intelligence, but her love of mystery novels is completely authentic. Jake Morrison is active DEA, but he really is working on a food blog in his spare time. The mixture of truth and fiction was somehow more unsettling than if everything had been completely fabricated. Sarah had formed genuine connections with people who were partly real and partly performance, creating relationships that existed in a gray area between authentic and artificial. The SUV turned into the parking garage of a downtown office building that looked like any other corporate facility. No obvious security, no government markings, nothing to suggest it housed anything more sensitive than accounting firms and consulting companies. But as they descended to the third sub-level, Sarah noticed the subtle modifications that indicated serious security infrastructure. "Welcome to Federal Building 7, Thompson said as they parked next to an elevator that required keycard access. "Officially, this is a GSA administrative facility. Unofficially, it houses coordination operations for situations that require interagency cooperation." The elevator descended far deeper than the building's visible floors would suggest, finally, onto a corridor that belonged to a different era of government architecture. Fluorescent lighting, neutral carpeting, and the kind of institutional design that prioritized function over aesthetics. Sarah had worked in dozens of similar facilities during her operational years. Thompson led her through a series of security checkpoints, each more sophisticated than the last, biometric scanners, metal detectors, and personnel who studied her with the calm attention of professionals who'd been briefed on her capabilities and background. By the time they reached the main briefing room, Sarah felt like she was being processed into a facility designed to contain someone considerably more dangerous than a coffee shop barista. The briefing room contained 12 people seated around a conference table that could have accommodated twice that number. Sarah recognized several faces from her previous work, though most were new to her. At the head of the table sat Director Patricia Walsh, a woman whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by her complete lack of patience for bureaucratic inefficiency. Agent Morrison, Director Walsh said without preamble, "Thank you for coming voluntarily. Please take a seat and we'll begin immediately." The other people in the room represented a cross-section of federal agencies based on their bearing and the way they deferred to Walsh's authority.
48 hours ago, Walsh began. Activating a wall-mounted display screen, 5 men entered the Westfield Financial Tower in Seattle during peak business hours. They're holding approximately 200 hostages on the 32nd floor, including several high-value targets whose deaths would significantly impact national security. The screen showed building schematics, satellite imagery, and tactical assessments that had clearly been prepared by multiple agencies working in coordination. Sarah studied the information with professional interest, noting details about access points, structural vulnerabilities, and the challenges any rescue operation would face. Standard hostage negotiation protocols have been unsuccessful, Walsh continued. The subjects aren't making demands, aren't responding to communication attempts, and haven't indicated any clear objective beyond maintaining control of the hostages. They appear to be waiting for something, but we haven't determined what. Sarah leaned forward, studying the photographs of the hostage takers that appeared on the screen. 5 men, all appearing to be in their 30s or 40s, all with the kind of physical conditioning that suggested military or paramilitary training. But something about their positioning and equipment seemed familiar in a way that made her uncomfortable. What makes this a federal matter rather than local law enforcement? 3 of the hostages are foreign diplomats attending a trade conference. 1 is a federal judge. 2 are executives from defense contractors working on classified projects, and the building's security systems have been compromised in ways that suggest the operation was planned by people with access to information that should have been impossible to obtain. Walsh paused the presentation and fixed Sarah with a direct stare. More importantly, the tactical approach the subjects are using matches protocols from Operation Midnight, protocols that were classified at the highest levels and known to fewer than 20 people. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Midnight Sun had been one of her final operations before leaving the field, a complex extraction mission that had required innovative approaches to hostage situations. The protocols Walsh mentioned were techniques Sarah had developed specifically for scenarios where traditional negotiation and assault methods weren't viable. You think someone from the operation is involved, we think someone with knowledge of your methods is direct. The positioning, the timing, the target selection, all of it suggests they're specifically challenging conventional response capabilities while demonstrating familiarity with unconventional alternatives. Agent Thompson activated another section of the showing intercepts from communications within the building. 20 minutes ago, one of the subjects made a single transmission. They said, "Tell Rachel we're waiting for her to come home." The words hit Sarah like cold water. Someone was using innocent people as bait to draw her back into operations. Someone who knew her real identity, her capabilities, and exactly how to create a situation she wouldn't be able to ignore. The peaceful life she'd built hadn't just been discovered, it had been deliberately destroyed by people who wanted to force her return to the field. Who else knows I'm here? Need to know basis only. The hostage takers shouldn't have any way of knowing we've contacted unless there's a leak somewhere in the chain of command. Director Walsh stood and moved to the front of the room, her expression grim. Agent Morrison, I won't pretend this isn't a setup designed to manipulate you back into service, but the hostages are real. The threat is real, and we genuinely believe you're the only operative with the skills necessary to resolve the situation without massive casualties. Sarah studied the faces around the table, looking for signs of deception or hidden agendas. These were people she'd worked with and trusted during her operational years, but 3 years of civilian life had taught her that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford when innocent lives were at stake. What's the current tactical assessment? Building assault would result in significant casualties among the hostages. The subjects have positioned themselves to maximize defensive advantages while maintaining clear fields of fire toward all access points. They've also demonstrated the ability to monitor law enforcement communications, suggesting sophisticated electronic surveillance. Time constraints, unknown. They haven't made any demands or indicated any deadline, which makes the situation more dangerous rather than less. People who don't negotiate are people who've already decided how this ends. Sarah absorbed the information while her mind automatically began developing operational approaches. The patterns Walsh had described, which techniques she'd used in similar situations but adapted in ways that suggested intimate familiarity with her methods. Someone who'd worked with her closely enough to understand not just what she did but how she thought. I need to see the building personally. Satellite imagery and schematics don't provide enough detail for this kind of operation. Already arranged.
We have a forward command post 6 blocks from the target location, full surveillance capabilities, direct communication with on-site personnel, and equipment suitable for any approach you might want to attempt. Walsh gestured to Agent Thompson, who stood and gathered a stack of files from the conference table. Agent Thompson will serve as your liaison and tactical support. Agent Rodriguez will handle communications and logistics. You'll have full operational authority for the duration of the mission. Sarah felt the familiar weight of command responsibilities settling over her shoulders. For 3 years her biggest decision had been which coffee blend to recommend to customers. Now she was being asked to take control of a situation where one wrong choice could result in hundreds of deaths. Transportation to Seattle? Federal flight leaves in 30 minutes. You'll be on site within 2 hours. As the briefing concluded and people began filing out of the room, Director Walsh approached Sarah directly. "Rachel, I know this feels like a betrayal. Your retirement was supposed to be permanent, and we violated that agreement by keeping you under surveillance. But the people in that building are going to die if we can't resolve this situation, and you're the only person with the expertise necessary to save them." Sarah met Walsh's eyes, seeing genuine regret alongside the professional determination. "And after this? Do I get to go back to making coffee, or am I being conscripted permanently? That depends on how this operation concludes. If you can resolve the situation without casualties, you'll have earned the right to disappear again completely this time. No surveillance, no monitoring, no interference. True retirement. And if I can't, then we'll face that situation when we come to it." Sarah nodded, understanding that she was being offered a chance to earn her freedom by risking everything she'd tried to protect by leaving the field. The innocent barista who'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of being invisible was about to become someone else entirely, someone capable of walking into a building full of armed hostiles and finding a way to save lives that others couldn't. Agent Thompson handed her a tactical vest and equipment bag, professional gear that felt familiar despite the years she'd spent away from it. "Aircraft is waiting on the roof. Full briefing continuation during flight." As they moved toward the elevator that would take them to the helipad, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in a mirrored wall panel. The woman reflected there looked nothing like the quiet barista who'd made coffee that morning. This woman had the bearing and alertness of someone preparing for combat, someone whose skills had been dormant but not forgotten. The peaceful life was over. The question now was whether Sarah could remember enough of who she'd been before to save the lives of people she'd never met, people who were counting on her to be more than the invisible woman she'd trained herself to become. The helicopter lifted off from the building's roof, carrying her toward a confrontation that would determine whether her 3 years of hiding had been worth the sacrifice, or whether some responsibilities were too important to abandon regardless of the personal cost. Seattle's skyline appeared through the aircraft's windows 40 minutes later, the familiar landmarks looking different when viewed through the lens of an active operation. Somewhere in that maze of buildings, people were waiting for her to save them from a situation that had been specifically designed to draw her out of retirement. The game was already in motion, and Sarah was no longer just a player, she was the prize the other side had been trying to claim. The forward command post occupied the top floor of an office building directly across from the Westfield Financial Tower, providing an unobstructed view of the target location. Sarah stood at the reinforced windows, studying the building where 200 people waited for someone to save them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Seattle's downtown district, but the 32nd floor of the target building remained brightly lit, a beacon that drew her attention like a challenge. "Thermal imaging shows the hostages are concentrated in the northeast corner," Agent Thompson reported, pointing to a bank of monitors displaying real-time surveillance data. "The subjects have established overlapping fields of fire covering all potential access points. Standard breach protocols would result in immediate casualties." Sarah examined the tactical displays while her mind processed possibilities that weren't apparent to conventional assault teams. The positioning patterns matched her own methods, but with modifications that suggested whoever was directing the operation understood her techniques well enough to counter them. Communication attempts, unsuccessful. "They respond to confirm they're receiving our transmissions, but they won't engage in negotiation. 20 minutes ago they repeated the message about waiting for Rachel to come home." Agent Rodriguez approached with a communication headset and tactical equipment that looked military-grade rather than standard FBI issue. "Direct line to the on-scene commander. SWAT teams are positioned but holding for your assessment." Sarah accepted the equipment while continuing to study the building's structure. 32 floors of modern construction, multiple stairwells, elevator shafts and maintenance access points that created a three-dimensional puzzle requiring careful analysis. But the real challenge wasn't architectural, it was psychological. Someone who knew her methods intimately had created this situation specifically to test whether she could overcome her own tactical approaches when used against her. It was a chess match where her opponent knew every move she'd ever made, while she had to deduce their capabilities from limited information. I need building schematics, maintenance schedules and security protocols from the past 6 months. Someone had inside access to plan this operation, and understanding how they gathered intelligence might reveal their limitations. Thompson activated additional displays showing the requested information. Building management has been cooperative. No unusual access requests, no new maintenance contracts, no security modifications that would have provided the kind of detailed knowledge the subjects are demonstrating. Sarah studied the patterns, looking for anomalies that might indicate how the operation had been planned. The positioning was too perfect to be improvised, suggesting months of preparation and detailed reconnaissance. But the intelligence requirements went beyond physical surveillance. Personnel files for building security, maintenance staff and anyone with master key access, already compiled. Rodriguez handed her a tablet containing hundreds of employee records. Background checks are ongoing, but nothing obvious has surfaced yet. Sarah scrolled through the information, looking for connections that might not be apparent to investigators who hadn't worked in the field. Former military, recent terminations, financial difficulties, anything that might create vulnerability to recruitment or coercion. After 20 minutes of review, one name caught her attention. Marcus Jennings, head of building security, former Army, discharged 3 years ago. Same time frame as when I left active duty. Thompson leaned over to examine the file. Clean record, no disciplinary issues. What makes him significant? He was assigned to Joint Task Force Phoenix during his final deployment. I worked with Phoenix on 2 operations, including Midnight Sun. The connection created a direct link between her operational past and the current crisis. Marcus Jennings would have had access to classified information about her methods, and his position as building security chief would have provided the inside knowledge necessary to plan such a precise operation. Current location of Jennings, unknown. He called in sick this morning and hasn't responded to contact attempts. His apartment appears to have been vacated recently. Sarah set down the tablet and moved back to the windows overlooking the target building. The pieces of the puzzle were becoming clearer, but the picture they created was more disturbing than she'd anticipated. This wasn't just about bringing her back into operational work. Someone with intimate knowledge of her background was using innocent people to force a direct confrontation. I'm going in. Thompson looked alarmed. Agent Morrison, we haven't developed a comprehensive assault plan. The risk factors are too high for solo infiltration. The risk factors are too high for any other approach. They're expecting traditional tactics, and they've positioned themselves to counter everything in the standard playbook. But they're also expecting me to overthink this situation, to spend hours developing complex strategies that account for every variable. Sarah began checking the tactical equipment Rodriguez had provided, muscle memory taking over as she verified weapons, communication gear, and emergency medical supplies. The familiar weight of operational equipment felt both strange and natural after 3 years of civilian life. Sometimes the best approach is the most direct one. They want me to come to them. They've created a situation where negotiation isn't possible and standard assault methods would result in casualties, but they've also created a scenario where I have to enter the building to resolve it. Director Walsh's voice came through the communication system from the federal facility in Portland. Rachel, what's your assessment of success probability? Sarah considered the question while studying the building's layout one final time. Mathematical probability analysis had never been her strength. She'd always relied on intuition and adaptability rather than statistical modeling. Unknown variables make precise calculations impossible, but the alternative is accepting that 200 people die while we develop plans that may not work anyway. Understood. You have full operational authority. All support personnel are at your disposal. Sarah moved toward the equipment staging area where specialized gear had been assembled for various contingency plans. Climbing equipment, electronic surveillance tools, weapon systems, and communications devices that would allow coordination with the command post during the operation. But as she examined the options, Sarah realized that success would depend more on psychology than technology. Whoever was directing the hostage situation knew her operational methods but might not fully understand how 3 years of civilian life had changed her approach to problem solving. The barista who'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of being invisible had learned patience, observation, and the value of small gestures that created significant results. Those weren't skills taught in tactical training programs, but they might prove more valuable than conventional assault techniques. "I'm going in through the parking garage," Sarah announced, surprising the assembled tactical personnel who'd been expecting a more complex infiltration plan. "Minimal equipment, no communication devices that could be detected, and no backup until I signal that the hostages are secure." Agent Thompson looked incredulous. "That's the most obvious approach. They'll be watching all ground-level access points. They'll be watching for someone who's trying to be clever. They won't be expecting someone who walks in through the front door because that's where they want her to go." Sarah selected basic equipment: sidearm, knife, first aid supplies, and a small communication device that could be activated once the situation was resolved. Everything else would have to be improvised based on circumstances she couldn't predict. As she prepared to leave the command post, Agent Rodriguez approached with a concerned expression. "Rachel, this feels wrong, too easy, too convenient. Like you're walking into a trap that's designed specifically for you." "It is a trap designed specifically for me, but traps work both ways. The people who set this up know my old methods, but they don't know who I've become during the past 3 years." Sarah moved toward the exit, then paused and turned back to the assembled personnel. "If this goes wrong, if I don't signal within 2 hours, proceed with standard assault protocols. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough." The elevator descended to the parking garage level, giving Sarah a few minutes of solitude to mentally prepare for what lay ahead. For 3 years her biggest worry had been running out of coffee beans during the morning rush. Now she was about to walk into a building full of armed hostiles to save people she'd never met. But as the elevator reached the garage level, Sarah realized she wasn't the same person who'd left operational work 3 years ago. The barista who'd learned to read customer moods, to anticipate needs, to provide comfort in small gestures, had developed skills that complemented rather than replaced her tactical training. The walk across downtown Seattle to the Westfield Financial Tower took 12 minutes, time Sarah used to observe pedestrian patterns, vehicle traffic, and the positioning of law enforcement personnel who were trying to maintain discrete perimeters around the target location. Everything appeared normal to casual observers, but Sarah could see the subtle signs of a major operation in progress. The building's lobby was deserted except for 2 uniformed police officers who'd been stationed at the security desk. They recognized her from briefing photographs and nodded respectfully as she approached the elevator bank. 32nd floor is locked down, one of them reported. Elevators are under their control, stairwells are monitored, and building security systems have been compromised. Sarah pressed the elevator call button and waited, knowing that the simple action was being observed by people who'd spent months planning for this moment. When the doors opened, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the 32nd floor, committing herself to whatever waited above. The elevator climbed steadily, each floor bringing her closer to a confrontation that would determine whether her 3 years of peaceful life had been worth the sacrifice. As the numbers increased on the display panel, Sarah felt herself transitioning from the invisible barista she'd become back to the operative she'd once been. But this time was different. This time she carried the patience she'd learned from making thousands of cups of coffee, the observation skills she'd developed from watching customers day after day, and the understanding that sometimes the most important victories were the quiet ones that nobody noticed. The elevator reached the 32nd floor and stopped. The doors remained closed for several seconds, then opened to reveal a reception area that had been transformed into a tactical strongpoint. 5 men in body armor stood positioned to cover all approaches, their weapons trained on the elevator doors with professional precision. "Welcome home, Rachel," said a familiar voice from behind the reception desk. Marcus Jennings stepped into view, wearing the same tactical gear as his associates but carrying himself with the authority of someone in command. "We've been waiting for you." Sarah stepped out of the elevator with her hands visible but ready to move quickly if necessary. The reunion with someone from her operational past felt surreal after 3 years of civilian interactions, like stepping back into a world she'd hoped to leave behind permanently. "Hello, Marcus. Interesting career change. Necessary career change. Some people get to retire and make coffee. Others have to deal with the consequences of operations that were supposed to stay buried." Sarah counted 5 hostiles in immediate view, but thermal imaging had suggested additional personnel positioned throughout the floor. The hostages were visible through glass partition walls grouped in an area where they could be monitored but protected from potential crossfire. "What do you want?" Marcus smiled without humor, the expression of someone who'd been planning this conversation for a long time. "I want you to understand what happens to people who get left behind when operations go wrong. I want you to experience what it feels like when your government decides you're expendable, and the hostages, collateral damage. Same as the people who died because of decisions you made during Midnight Sun." Sarah felt the weight of old guilt settling over her shoulders, memories of an operation that had ended successfully but left casualties that had never been officially acknowledged. Marcus was right about people being left behind, about consequences that extended far beyond mission parameters, but she was also right about something else. 3 years of civilian life had taught her that guilt without action was simply self-indulgence, while guilt channeled into positive purpose could save lives that were still within reach. "Let them go, Marcus. This is between us." "No, this is about accountability. About facing the real costs of the choices you made. About understanding that some people don't get to disappear and start over." Sarah looked past Marcus to the hostages, 200 people whose only mistake had been showing up for work on the wrong day. Among them she could see faces that reminded her of her customers at Corner Café, ordinary people living quiet lives, deserving protection from the consequences of conflicts they'd never chosen to join. The invisible barista who'd spent 3 years learning to care about small gestures and human connections was about to discover whether those lessons could save lives when everything else had failed. The game Marcus had designed to bring her back was about to begin, but the rules had changed more than he realized. Sarah took a step forward, her movement careful but confident, and began the most important conversation of her life, not as the operative she'd once been, but as the person she'd become through 3 years of learning that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply show up and refuse to abandon people who needed help. The quiet barista was gone, but the person who'd replaced her was something Marcus hadn't planned for. Someone who understood that true strength came not from perfect tactics or superior firepower, but from the simple decision to stand between innocent people and the darkness that threatened to destroy them. Whatever happened next would determine whether Sarah's 3 years of peaceful invisibility had been preparation for this moment, or simply a delay before confronting responsibilities she'd never truly escaped. The conversation was about to begin, and 200 lives hung in the balance of what she said next. "You know what I learned making coffee for 3 years, Marcus?" Sarah kept her voice conversational, the same tone she'd used with difficult customers at Corner Café. "I learned that angry people usually aren't really angry about what they think they're angry about." Marcus shifted his position slightly, his weapon still trained on her but his expression showing curiosity despite himself. The other 4 men maintained their tactical positions, but Sarah could sense their attention focusing on the unexpected direction of the conversation. "You think this is about anger? I think this is about guilt. About being the one who survived when others didn't. About carrying responsibility for decisions that weren't entirely yours to make." Sarah took another small step forward, her movement casual but purposeful. "I know because I carried the same guilt for 3 years." The hostages watched in silence from behind the glass partition, 200 people whose lives depended on Sarah's ability to de-escalate a situation that had been designed to end in violence. She could see fear in their faces, but also hope as they realized someone had come for them. Marcus laughed bitterly. "You carried guilt, you disappeared into a comfortable civilian life while the rest of us dealt with congressional investigations, career destruction, and families who stopped returning phone calls. You don't know anything about guilt." "You're right, I don't know about those things, but I know about waking up every morning wondering if the people who died would still be alive if you'd made different choices. I know about questioning every decision because you've seen what happens when you get it wrong." Sarah's words carried the weight of genuine experience, and she could see Marcus processing the implications. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected to have with someone he'd viewed as having escaped consequences while others suffered. "The difference between us," Sarah continued, "is that you decided your pain justified hurting innocent people. I decided mine meant I needed to find ways to help people, even in small ways that nobody would notice." One of Marcus's associates, a younger man positioned near the stairwell access, spoke up for the first time. "Marcus, this isn't what we planned." She was supposed to try some tactical approach, not stand here having a therapy session. "Shut up, Davis." Marcus's response was sharp, but Sarah noticed the momentary loss of focus as he dealt with questions from his own team. Leadership under pressure required constant attention and divided attention created opportunities. Your team is questioning the plan because it's not working the way you expected, Sarah observed. That's what happens when you build a strategy around assumptions about how other people will behave. People change, Marcus. 3 years of civilian life changed me in ways you couldn't have predicted. She gestured toward the hostages with a movement that was careful not to seem threatening. These people remind me of my customers. Ordinary people trying to live quiet lives, showing up every day to do work that matters to them. They don't deserve to pay the price for operational decisions they had nothing to do with. Marcus's expression flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. You think you can talk your way out of this, make us feel guilty about holding people accountable for their actions. I think you already feel guilty, and that's why you're here. You're not holding anyone accountable, you're trying to force someone else to carry the same burden you've been carrying alone. Sarah took another step forward, now close enough that the tactical situation had shifted subtly. She was within range for close quarters combat, but also within range for genuine human connection. The choice of which approach to take was hers. The people who died during Midnight Sun weren't your fault any more than they were mine, but the people in this building right now, their lives are our responsibility, both of ours. You can choose to save them or to add to the casualty count of an operation that ended 3 years ago. The youngest member of Marcus's team, positioned near the windows, lowered his weapon slightly. Marcus, maybe we should consider other options. This isn't going the way we planned. There are no other options. Marcus's voice carried frustration and desperation. She needs to understand what it's like to have blood on her hands, to live with consequences she can't escape. I do understand, Sarah replied quietly. I've understood for 3 years, but understanding doesn't require adding more blood. It requires making different choices than the ones that created the problem in the first place. She could see the conflict in Marcus's face, the struggle between his desire for revenge and his recognition that she was offering something he hadn't expected. Not denial or justification, but acknowledgement, and a path toward resolution that didn't require more casualties. What are you proposing? Let the hostages go, all of them, right now. Then we can have the conversation you really want to have without innocent people paying the price for it. Marcus exchanged glances with his associates, and Sarah could see the team dynamic starting to fracture. Operations that depended on group cohesion became vulnerable when individual members started questioning the mission parameters. And then what? We surrender and spend the rest of our lives in federal prison. Then we figure out a solution that addresses the real problem, instead of creating new ones. You want accountability for what happened during Midnight Sun? Fine. I'll testify at whatever hearing or investigation you want. I'll take responsibility for my decisions and their consequences. The offer was genuine, and Marcus seemed to recognize that. For the first time since the conversation began, his weapon wavered slightly, no longer pointed directly at her center mass. You'd do that? Voluntarily submit to official scrutiny of classified operations? If it means these people go home safely to their families, yes. The accountability you're looking for doesn't require hostages, it requires someone willing to face consequences honestly. Sarah could sense the shift in the room's energy. The hostages were listening intently, hope replacing some of the fear in their expressions. Marcus's team members were exchanging looks that suggested their commitment to the operation was weakening. Davis, Richardson, maintain your positions, Marcus ordered, but his voice lacked the authority it had carried earlier. Marcus, the man called Richardson, responded, maybe we should consider her offer. This has gotten bigger than what we originally planned. The fracturing of team unity created the opportunity Sarah had been waiting for, not for a tactical assault, but for a human appeal that addressed the underlying motivations driving the situation. You know what I learned from 3 years of making coffee? Sarah asked again, her tone gentle but insistent. I learned that most people just want to be heard. They want someone to acknowledge their pain, and understand that their struggles matter. She looked directly at Marcus, then at each of his associates in turn. I hear you, all of you. I understand that you've been carrying burdens that shouldn't have been yours alone. I understand that you felt abandoned by people who should have supported you. The silence that followed was different from the tactical tension that had dominated the confrontation. This was the silence of people processing unexpected validation for feelings they'd thought were invisible. But holding these people hostage doesn't make your pain matter more. It just creates more pain for people who don't deserve it. Sarah gestured toward the partition where the hostages waited. They have families, responsibilities, dreams that matter to them just as much as your grievances matter to you.
Marcus lowered his weapon completely for the first time since Sarah had entered the building. You really think official accountability would make a difference? That congressional hearings and investigation reports would actually change anything? I think it's the only way to find out, and I think it's better than adding to the casualty count of an operation that already cost too much. The young man called Davis stepped away from his position near the stairwell. I didn't sign up to hurt innocent people. I wanted answers about what happened to my brother during that mission, not to become a terrorist. The admission created a cascade effect among the remaining team members. Richardson nodded in agreement, while the others began lowering their weapons and stepping back from their tactical positions. This is it, Marcus, Sarah said quietly. This is the moment where you choose what kind of person you want to be, someone who adds to the tragedy, or someone who finds a way to end it. Marcus stood in silence for nearly a minute, his internal struggle visible in his expression. Then he activated the electronic locks on the partition holding the hostages and stepped aside as 200 people began moving toward the elevators. Thank you, Sarah said simply. As the last of the hostages filed into the elevators, Marcus and his associates laid down their weapons and moved to the center of the reception area. The confrontation that had been designed to end in violence was concluding with surrender and the possibility of genuine accountability. Sarah activated her communication device and spoke to the command post. All hostages secure, subjects in custody, no casualties. Agent Thompson's voice crackled through the device. Confirmed. Excellent work, Agent Morrison. But as Sarah looked at Marcus and his team, she realized the work wasn't finished. The real conversation about accountability and consequences was just beginning. The hostage situation had ended, but the underlying issues that had created it required different solutions than tactical operations could provide. What happens now? Marcus asked. Now we do what we should have done 3 years ago, Sarah replied. We tell the truth about what happened, accept responsibility for our parts in it, and find ways to honor the people we lost by making sure their deaths weren't meaningless. The invisible barista who'd spent 3 years learning to help people in small ways had just prevented a tragedy by applying those same lessons to the most high-stakes situation of her career. The peaceful life was over, but the person it had created was exactly who she needed to be to save 200 innocent lives. As federal agents entered the building to process the scene, Sarah looked out at Seattle's skyline and realized she'd found something she hadn't been looking for during her 3 years of hiding. Not just peace but purpose that came from understanding that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply refuse to let other people's pain create more suffering. The barista was gone, but the person who remained was someone who could bridge the gap between the operative she'd been and the helper she'd become.
Someone who understood that true strength came not from superior tactics or firepower but from the willingness to stand between people and harm, even when that meant having difficult conversations with people who had every reason to want revenge. The quiet life had prepared her for this moment in ways tactical training never could have. And now, finally she was ready to face whatever came next. 6 months later, Sarah walked through the doors of a small training facility outside Washington, D.C., carrying a box of fresh coffee and pastries from a local bakery. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating a classroom where 20 federal agents sat waiting for an unconventional lesson in crisis resolution. Good morning, Sarah said, setting the refreshments on a table near the front of the room. Before we begin today's session on psychological approaches to hostage negotiation, help yourselves to coffee, real coffee, not the institutional stuff you're used to. The agents exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about an instructor who prioritized caffeine quality over immediate tactical briefings. Sarah had learned that small gestures of care often opened minds more effectively than authoritative presentations. Agent Morrison called out a young woman in the second row. The case files suggest you resolved the Seattle situation through conversation rather than force. How do we replicate that approach in other scenarios? Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee and moved to the center of the room, her bearing confident but approachable. You don't replicate it. Every situation is unique. Every person involved brings different motivations and fears. What you learn are principles, not scripts. She activated a wall display showing the layout of the Westfield Financial Tower. The Seattle hostage takers expected tactical responses because that's how they'd been trained to think. They prepared for assault teams, negotiation specialists, and psychological pressure. They didn't prepare for someone who treated them like human beings with legitimate grievances. Agent Collins, a veteran negotiator from the FBI, raised his hand. Doesn't that approach validate criminal behavior? If we acknowledge their complaints, aren't we encouraging similar tactics? There's a difference between validating feelings and accepting methods, Sarah replied. Marcus Jennings and his team had genuine grievances about being abandoned after a classified operation went wrong. Those feelings were real and deserved acknowledgement. Their choice to take hostages was unacceptable regardless of their motivations. She moved to another section of the display showing communication transcripts from the operation. The breakthrough came when I separated their pain from their actions. I could acknowledge their suffering without approving their choices. A senior agent from the back row spoke up. What about situations where subjects aren't rational, where mental illness or extremist ideology prevents reasonable dialogue? Sarah had anticipated this question because it addressed the limitations of her approach. Not every situation can be resolved through conversation, but more can be than we typically assume. Most people, even in crisis, retain some capacity for reason if they feel heard and understood. She returned to the refreshment table and refilled her coffee cup, using the pause to let the agents process the information. During my 3 years working as a barista, I learned that difficult customers rarely stayed difficult once they felt respected. The same principle applies to crisis situations. Agent Martinez, a hostage rescue team leader, looked skeptical. Customers who want extra foam in their latte aren't holding people at gunpoint. The stakes change the dynamics completely. The stakes intensify the dynamics, but they don't change the fundamental human need to be understood, Sarah responded. Higher stakes mean greater desperation, which often means people are more willing to listen to alternatives if they believe those alternatives address their core concerns. She activated a new section of the presentation showing psychological profiles from various resolved cases. Every person who takes hostages believes they have no other option. Your job is to help them see alternatives they haven't considered, not to convince them their grievances are invalid. The training session continued for 3 hours, covering case studies, communication techniques, and the psychological foundations of crisis intervention. Sarah found herself drawing frequently on lessons learned during her civilian years, insights about human nature that complemented rather than replaced traditional tactical training. As the agents filed out for their lunch break, Agent Collins approached the front of the room. Agent Morrison, I have to ask about your personal situation. The reports indicate you were offered full retirement after resolving the Seattle case. Why did you choose to return to active duty? Sarah considered the question while organizing her materials. The answer was complicated, involving factors she was still processing 6 months later. I discovered that retirement wasn't what I thought it would be, she said finally. I thought I wanted invisibility and peace, but what I actually needed was purposeful work that used my skills to help people. This position lets me do that without the isolation of deep cover operations. Agent Collins nodded thoughtfully. Do you miss the quiet life, the anonymity? Sometimes. But I've learned that hiding from responsibility doesn't eliminate it. It just means other people have to carry burdens that should be shared. As Collins left for lunch, Sarah remained in the classroom reviewing notes for the afternoon session on team dynamics during crisis situations. Through the window, she could see federal agents moving between buildings, people dedicated to protecting others in ways that often went unrecognized. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Director Walsh. Congressional testimony scheduled for next month. Are you prepared? Sarah typed back quickly, ready to tell the truth about Midnight Sun and everything that followed. The promise she'd made to Marcus in the Westfield Financial Tower was being kept. Official hearings about classified operations, testimony about decisions that had resulted in casualties, accountability that extended beyond closed-door briefings to public scrutiny of government actions. It wouldn't bring back the people who died, but it might prevent future situations where operational personnel felt abandoned by the institutions they'd served. Sarah had learned that healing sometimes required the exposure of wounds that had been hidden for too long. Her new position as special instructor for crisis psychology allowed her to influence how future agents approached situations like the one Marcus had created, not through superior firepower or advanced tactics, but through understanding that most conflicts had human solutions if you were willing to look for them. The afternoon session focused on team leadership during crisis situations, drawing on Sarah's experience managing both tactical operations and coffee shop staff during busy periods. His principles weren't as different as most people assumed. Clear communication, defined roles, and mutual trust, she explained to the returning agents. Whether you're coordinating an assault team or managing morning rush hour, success depends on people understanding their responsibilities and believing their teammates will fulfill theirs. As the day's training concluded, Sarah felt the satisfaction that came from work that aligned with her values and utilized her abilities. This wasn't the invisible peace she'd sought during her barista years, but it was something better: visible contribution to preventing the kinds of tragedies that had shaped her career. Walking to her car in the facility's parking lot, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when federal agents had appeared at Corner Café. The quiet barista was gone, but the person who'd replaced her was someone who could honor both her operational experience and the lessons learned during 3 years of civilian life. Her apartment in Arlington was larger than her Portland space had been, with windows that offered views of the Potomac River and the monuments beyond. It wasn't the anonymous refuge her previous home had provided, but it was a place where she could prepare for work that mattered and rest between efforts to prevent others from experiencing the isolation she'd chosen for herself. Tomorrow would bring another training session with agents learning to see crisis situations as opportunities for human connection rather than just tactical challenges. Next week would bring preparation for congressional testimony that might finally provide the accountability Marcus and his team had sought through desperate measures. The invisible barista who'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of being overlooked had become someone who chose visibility in service of helping others avoid the mistakes that had shaped her own journey. The quiet life was over, but the purposeful life was just beginning. Sarah drove home through DC traffic, content with the knowledge that her skills were being used to save lives rather than hide from the consequences of previous missions. The woman who'd learned to make perfect coffee had discovered that the same attention to detail, patience, and care for others could be applied to much larger challenges. The transformation was complete, and for the first time since leaving operational work years earlier, Sarah felt truly at peace with who she'd chosen to become. 2 years after the congressional hearings that had finally closed the book on Operation Midnight Sun, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her training facility. Marcus Jennings stood in her office doorway, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a small wrapped package. "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit," he said, his voice carrying none of the desperation that had marked their last conversation in Seattle. "I wanted to thank you personally." Sarah gestured to a chair across from her desk. Marcus looked different, healthier somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for years had finally been lifted. The federal investigation had resulted in accountability measures and support systems for operatives dealing with classified mission trauma, changes that had come too late for some, but would help others avoid similar struggles. "How are you adjusting?" Sarah asked. "Better than expected. The counseling program you recommended has helped, and having the Midnight Sun findings made public gave me something I didn't realize I needed: validation that our concerns were legitimate." Marcus set the package on her desk. "This is for you." Sarah unwrapped the package to find a simple wooden plaque with an inscription: "To Sarah Chen, who proved that the strongest weapon is sometimes just listening. Thank you for saving all of us that day. You didn't just save the hostages," Marcus continued. "You saved my team and me from becoming something we never wanted to be. We were so focused on being heard that we forgot other people's voices mattered too." Sarah studied the plaque, remembering the fear and desperation in the Westfield Tower reception area. "What are you doing now?" "Running a support group for veterans dealing with classified mission stress. Turns out there are a lot of people who needed someone to understand what they were going through." Marcus smiled genuinely for the first time in their acquaintance. "I'm using the same principles you used with us: listen first, judge never, find solutions that help everyone." After Marcus left, Sarah remained in her office as evening settled over the training facility. Through her window she could see new agents practicing crisis resolution scenarios in the outdoor training area, learning to approach conflicts with empathy rather than force as their first option. Her phone displayed a message from Dr. Emily Foster, the pediatrician from Corner Café, who'd become an unexpected friend during the months following the Seattle operation. "Coffee next week when you're in Portland for the conference. Same time, different location." Sarah smiled at the message. Emily had been one of the few genuine civilians in her carefully constructed barista life, and maintaining that friendship had helped her understand that not every relationship required deception or professional distance. The following week's conference in Portland brought Sarah back to the city where her quiet life had ended so dramatically.
She met Emily at a small cafe just blocks from where Corner Café had been before its closure following the federal operation that had revealed its true purpose. "Do you ever regret it?" Emily asked as they settled at a window table with their drinks. "Giving up the peaceful life for all this complexity and responsibility?" Sarah considered the question while watching pedestrians hurry past on the sidewalk outside. "I thought I wanted invisibility, but what I actually needed was purposeful visibility. The barista job taught me how to help people in small ways. This work lets me help people in bigger ways. And the federal hearings, the public scrutiny, necessary. Sometimes accountability requires exposure, even when it's uncomfortable." Sarah sipped her latte, noting that it wasn't quite as good as the one she'd made at Corner Café. "The hearings led to policy changes that will prevent other operatives from feeling abandoned the way Marcus and his team did." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I still think about that afternoon when you asked how I was doing. It was such a small gesture, but it meant everything to someone who was completely exhausted and felt invisible. That's when I realized you saw people differently than most service workers do. Everyone has a story, everyone's carrying something that isn't visible on the surface. I learned that making coffee, and it served me well in crisis negotiation." They talked for another hour about Emily's work at the hospital, Sarah's latest training innovations, and the ways their friendship had evolved despite the unusual circumstances of its origin. When they parted ways, Sarah felt the contentment that came from relationships built on genuine connection rather than professional necessity. That evening, Sarah walked through downtown Portland one final time before her flight back to Washington. The city looked the same, but her relationship to it had fundamentally changed. This was no longer the place where she'd tried to disappear, but the place where she'd learned that true strength came from choosing to be visible when people needed help. Her phone buzzed with a text from Agent Thompson, "New situation developing in Denver, requesting your consultation on psychological approach. Can you be there tomorrow?" Sarah typed back quickly, "On my way." Standing at the airport gate waiting for her red-eye flight, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible barista to federal crisis specialist. The quiet life had ended, but it had prepared her for work that used every skill she'd developed during both her operational years and her civilian ones. The woman who'd once made perfect lattes now helped people navigate their worst moments with dignity and hope. The barista who'd learned to read customer moods now read crisis situations and found paths toward resolution that preserved everyone's humanity. As her flight took off into the night sky, carrying her toward another situation where people needed someone who understood that behind every conflict were human beings deserving of respect and care, Sarah smiled at the realization that she'd finally found her true calling. Not as an invisible operator conducting missions in the shadows, and not as an anonymous service worker avoiding responsibility, but as someone who stood visibly at the intersection of conflict and resolution, helping others find their way through darkness towards something better. The barista was gone, but the person she'd become was exactly who the world needed her to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.